Hi everybody, I'm the Drink Pro, and today we're drinking Buffalo Trace. So today we've got Buffalo Trace. This is a classic bourbon. Buffalo Trace Distillery actually makes this product. And what's interesting to me is Buffalo Trace isn't a legacy bourbon like a lot of bourbons out there where it's named after someone who was famous in the bourbon industry. No, Buffalo Trace was actually named because the distillery was named Buffalo Trace and was issuing all kinds of interesting whiskeys, but they didn't have their own product. And so they made their own product called Buffalo Trace. If you ask whiskey drinkers, good sound, a lot of them will tell you Buffalo Trace is a classic bourbon, a very good entry point into the world of higher-end bourbons where you're really trying to explore interesting flavors. This is almost done, obviously, so you know I enjoy it. Buffalo Trace is also known for having really good store picks. A lot of the local liquor stores here in my area will end up going down to Buffalo Trace and get a group of people together and then come back with a store pick. Now the way you know you've got a store pick is if it has a little sticker on it, like this one. I don't know if you can see that, but the regular standard Buffalo Trace is still a really good quality product and nothing to sneeze at. So without further ado, let's drink some Buffalo Trace. I got my Glencairns right here. Now for some of you, I want to make this show something for people of all different whiskey experience levels. So Glencairn glass, and it's Glencairn, not Glencairn. I, for a long time, said Glencairn, and then I read the actual name and saw there was no I between the R and the N at the end. Glencairn. These are really good glasses for tasting and smelling whiskey. Now, depends on what you look for in a tasting experience. Because some people are very sensitive to the ethanol alcohol in whiskey. They might not like this tulip-shaped glass, because what this does is it sort of focuses all of the odors towards your nose, and that includes the alcohol. And when you swirl it, it should kind of make a little column of alcohol out of the glass. The advantage of that is then you can get your nose around the sides and really open up the sense from the whiskey. But the bad side is if you're sensitive to the ethanol, it can really, degrade your experience, and you might be better with a very small, straight-mouthed glass, a very small rocks glass, if you will. I've also seen people use other glasses that are even wider and more open. I have mixed feelings about those, but we'll get into that in the future videos. I like to do tastings with sort of a three-prong approach. I think about the nose, I think about the palate, and I think about the finish. The nose really just opens up and gives you your main sense of the whiskey. So when I put my face into this glass, I'm getting a very classic vanilla bourbon scent. There's some cherry in there, which is also a very classic bourbon note. But it's relatively tame. I mean, it's only 45% alcohol, which, compared to a lot of people who haven't been in whiskey a long time, that might seem relatively high. But there are lots of whiskeys out there that are over 50, even over 60% alcohol. So when you've gotten used to those higher cask strength, higher proof whiskeys, something that's relatively low, 43, 45, won't hit you the same way. In fact, most people that have been doing this a long time, at least that I know, tend not to like the 40% alcohol whiskeys because they feel too watered down. A law in the United States says that the minimum proof for bourbon has to be 80 proof or 40% alcohol. So a lot of whiskeys that are going to be your sort of budget line or your flagship line on the lower price point are going to try to stretch out the whiskey as far as they can, hence 40%. If you go to other countries, you might see lower proof points. Particularly in Eastern Europe, I've seen several countries from that region that have proof points in the 35, 37% range on American products, on Jack Daniels, on Jim Beam. So it's about where you're selling your product and maximizing your revenue. Whereas something like Buffalo Trace, which is proof to 45%, obviously that's going to be more about getting the right palate and figuring out the flavors that you want in your whiskey that's being sent to us, the consumer. So yeah, it's very vanilla. It's got a sweetness, but it's not real sharp in the sweetness. It's very soft and rounded. Some fruit notes in there. Maybe like an apple. I could probably get like a sweet apple in there. There might be a little baking spice as well. Just a hint of cinnamon, maybe some nutmeg, but probably cinnamon. There's a lot of different flavors that you can pick up just from your nose. Your smell, your olfactory senses are, I think, like 80%, 70%. Don't quote me on the percentage. But they're a very high percent of your taste. So without further ado, let's give this bad boy a taste. Now, I haven't eaten anything or drank anything for some time now. Part of the reason that's important is you really prime your palate with different things that you've eaten or drank before you try a whiskey. That's something worth experimenting on, and we'll experiment with it later on in my show as I continue to make more episodes and expand the nature of the program. But I also like to do 2 or 3 different tastings before I really come up with my flavor notes, just to acclimate myself to the whiskey no matter what I've had beforehand. See, that first taste was almost all grain. It was very sweet cereal notes. That second taste, though, I'm starting to get more of the nuance. I'm getting a little bit more of a peppery flavor in the mid palate and the finish. There's a little bit of sweetness there that might otherwise have been lost because I wasn't ready for the alcohol hit. Third time's a charm, though. Those apple notes are coming up. You got a classic sweetness, still relatively grain forward. It is going to have that malt sweetness, maybe hints of honey depending on who you ask about the profile. Definitely vanilla, definitely some apple, maybe some cherry mid-palate. I'm getting more of the sweetness when I'm going back on the nose. It's not really a honey component, but there's definitely that malty sugar that's very prominent in this pour. And a matter of fact, it kind of overwhelms some of the other elements of the pour. I really like Buffalo Trace store picks, as I talked about a little before, but I'm not as keen on the standard issue only because I've seen what it can do. It's a very interesting, complex mash bill and aging process, and these store picks just become beautiful. So the standard variant is good, but it's just lost a little luster, I think. I highly recommend it, though, if you're starting out into whiskey. Go pick up a bottle of Buffalo Trace. I mean, this bottle was probably $25. Maybe it'll be $30 or $35 if you can find it in your area. I know this isn't easy for everyone. It's technically an allocated bourbon, which we'll get into that later. But I think you shouldn't have too much trouble finding a bottle of Buffalo Trace if you're looking for it, if you're trying to find it. And I can't recommend it enough because it is a baseline for bourbon. If you like Buffalo Trace, you will like bourbon. If you don't, that doesn't mean you won't like bourbon. But that means you have to look into other areas, things that aren't within the normal range of the bourbon palate. So I think it's a great litmus test for how you're going to feel about a standard issue bourbon drinker's bourbon. Hope you enjoyed the show, everybody. Keep drinking like a professional. Cheers.